and little mutton and milk to replace it.
It also meant
currently
Māori were forced into
6:48.
environments which damaged health in other ways. Epidemiologist Dr. Alistair Woodward and Professor Tony Blackley put it like this in their book, A Healthy Country, A History of Life and Death in New Zealand.
There are many reports of crowded and poorly ventilated housing. Water was taken from shallow wells or from streams that were often contaminated by sewage or other wastes. Some typhoid outbreaks were caused by discharge of raw sewage from European settlements into open waterways, which then polluted traditional gathering sites for shellfish and other kaimoana.
What's worse, in the late 1800s, thousands of Māori had to attend the native land court to try and hold on to what little customary land remained.
If you don't know what the land court is, don't worry, we have another episode all about it. For now, just know that while they were waiting for court hearings, Māori had to spend weeks or even months around colonial towns and cities.
And what's so bad about that? Well, here's a poem about Auckland written in 1882.
Foul putrescence lieth on each side of the street,
46 extra
and in each festering backyard slops swelter in the heat. The cesspits belch forth gases on fever-laden air, and fever damp uprolleth from sewer gullies there. Death grins twixt each fence paling upon each passer-by, and the earthless privy boxes cry out, prepare to die.
In many 19th century towns and cities, it was totally normal to throw human waste into the streets or into a pit in your backyard.
Dangerous bugs from human waste easily contaminated wells, rivers and lakes.
Contaminated water was a major cause of death in Aotearoa, especially for young children.
One of New Zealand's more deadly cities was Christchurch. In 1870, the city's death rate was twice the national average.
If you want to stop the epidemic of disease, number one thing you need to do is keep poo out of your drinking water.
And in the late 19th century, the government stepped up its game on that front.
Thank goodness. In 1882, Christchurch became the first city in New Zealand with a proper underground sewage system.
Over the next few decades, the government invested huge amounts of cash building sewers and high-pressure water systems.
There are two imposters among us.
Process. Ooh, nothing's changed. Even in the 1950s, most communities didn't have access to safe drinking water.
And some places in New Zealand still have problems with dodgy drinking water today.
Indeed they do. The epidemics of tokotokorangi, the spear of heaven, lasted more than 100 years.
Measles, typhoid, whooping cough, influenza, tuberculosis. How many people died from all these diseases? Well, we just don't know exactly.
Because the problem is that for most New Zealand history, there isn't good nationwide data on the Māori population. Instead, historians have to make estimates based on local surveys, written reports, and oral history.
Our best estimate is that between the time James Cook arrived in 1769 and the year 1900, the Māori population fell by 50 to 60%, from roughly 100,000 people to less than 50,000.
The Musket Wars and the New Zealand Wars account for some of those deaths, but it's likely far more Māori died from disease than were ever killed in combat.
But here's a second weird fact about New Zealand's history of epidemics. Māori death tolls from disease were actually relatively low compared to other colonised indigenous people.
In Aotearoa, impacts of colonisation like disease and war cut the Māori population in half, which was clearly horrifying and with all kinds of other damaging cultural impacts. But in other places around the world, the impacts were even more devastating.
In the United States, it's thought the Native American population fell by around 90%.
The skipper got 2 votes.
In Australia, historians estimate the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations fell between 80 to 95%.
You see similar numbers for indigenous communities all over the Pacific and the Americas.
So why didn't that happen in Aotearoa?
Well, it's possible it did happen. A few historians think we've underestimated how many Māori were living in Aotearoa before Europeans arrived. And if they're right, then the death toll for disease might have been similar to other indigenous communities.
But if we're sticking with the most widely accepted numbers, there are a few explanations for the lower death toll.
First, timing. When colonisation happened in other parts of the world, like America, there were a lot of absolutely massive epidemics.
I better respond to this right now.
So a lot of people who got ships to colonise those countries carried the infections with them.
But by the time Aotearoa was colonised, those epidemics were mostly over, so there weren't as many sick people on the ships coming here.
Aotearoa was a long way from Europe, so if any colonists were sick when they set sail, they usually either died or recovered before they got here.
And this meant some of the deadliest diseases, like smallpox and cholera, either never made it to Aotearoa or caused relatively small outbreaks.
You received a total of 6 votes.
And at least to start with, there was some collaboration between Pākehā and Māori to improve Māori health.
Yeah, like in 1825, a Māori chief, Te Pihi Kupe, visited England and received a smallpox vaccine. He was the first ever Māori to be vaccinated.
By 1854, a national campaign was underway to vaccinate more Māori against smallpox, and Māori were keen to take up the vaccines.
Pākehā doctors were appointed as native medical attendants to Māori communities.
Pamphlets with advice on health and sanitation written in Te Reo Māori was distributed far and wide.
Governor George Grey also built several small hospitals in colonial settlements, which he encouraged Māori to use free of charge. Europeans had to pay for treatment.
Although, as we're about to see, there was a catch to this free healthcare.
Some colonists were actually pretty annoyed about Governor Grey building hospitals for Māori in their settlements. Like, for example, in 1853, the Otago Settlers Association complained
Bye, girl!
Will be for the natives.
You received
It ought to be on one of the reserves and not in Dunedin. There are no natives, which is so distant from and inaccessible to their locations. But the Otago Settlers Association was missing the point. The idea of Governor Grey's government-funded healthcare wasn't just to treat sickness. It was to pull Māori into contact with Europeans.
Catch, it always is.
And some colonial leaders, like Governor Grey, hoped British-style healthcare would encourage Māori to assimilate into British society.
But Māori were often very wary of hospitals, and that was a fair call. 19th century hospitals were dangerous, unhygienic places. Until the 1870s, surgeons didn't even wash their hands. And in the middle of all this, in the 1860s, the New Zealand Wars happened, and a lot of those early health efforts were interrupted.
By the 1890s, there was a new generation of leaders taking on the challenge of Māori health, especially a group called the Young Māori Party.
The Young Māori Party were a bunch of Māori men who'd graduated from the Anglican Mission School, Te Aute College in Hawke's Bay.
Many of these guys went on to become lawyers, historians, politicians, and doctors.
They wanted to bridge the gap between Māori and Pākehā, encouraging both the adoption of new knowledge and the preservation of aspects of Māori culture. For example, the Ngāti Mutunga leaders, Maui Pomare and Te Rangihiroa, also known as Peter Buck, travelled around Māori communities in the early 1900s, encouraging people to improve sanitation, dig new drains, improve ventilation, and set up latrines, basically old-fashioned outside toilets or long drops.
And when a kaumātua complained to Te Rangihiroa that latrines were a Pākehā invention with no role in the Māori world, he didn't dismiss those concerns.
No, instead, he quoted old pūrākau, whakatauki, whakatauaki stories and sayings which referred to latrines way back in the past. There's one famous one, Ngā Te Pai Hamutsi, which loosely translated means something like bite the toilet seat. It's sort of like the Māori version of bite the bullet or grin and bear it. Because it's not like Māori were running around pulling everywhere and they didn't have their own systems in place. We just had more condensed areas and different ways of doing things with bigger populations.
People like Te Rangihiroa were combining new knowledge of medicine but explaining it in a way that made sense in a Māori context, and that turned out to be highly effective.
Especially in the wake of the New Zealand Wars, when many Māori were understandably sceptical of anything linked to the Pākehā world.
Māori nurses like Ākenehi Hei of Te Whakatōhia also learned to blend European medicine with mātauranga Māori, which is traditional Māori knowledge.
In 1909, Ākenehi travelled to a gum digging camp at Te Kao in Northland to treat a typhoid epidemic among local Māori. She took a hardline approach, sculling patients who refused to accept styles of medical treatment. The community turned on her and refused to listen, although they
We've learned.
But Akenehe learned a lesson from this. She wrote in her journal
At least I got
great discretion must be used not to
extra
offend
beans.
the patient's beliefs, and at the same time uphold one's own mission.